Story 1. Demonic Doll of Robert. My grandmother, this journal is sitting on my desk right now. I haven't to open it in 3 days. Because every time I do, I find new pages that weren't there before. New entries written in handwriting that was almost like my grandmother, but not quite. New confessions about things that happened to her in Illinois. Terrible things, creepy things, things that led her to flee her childhood home and never return. And the worst part is that the final entry is dated yesterday. My grandmother has been dead for 7 years. My name is Catherine. I'm 36 years old. I work in publishing. I live in Boston now, far away from Illinois where my family came from. I've spent my entire adult life building a rational, orderly existence based on facts and evidence and things that can be explained through science and logic. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in curses. I certainly don't believe in demonic dolls or haunted objects or any of the supernatural nonsense that most people dismiss without a second thought. I believed that right up until I inherited my grandmother's house and found the journal hidden in the basement walls. The house sits just outside Springfield, Illinois. It's been empty for years, left to decay and fall apart while various relatives argued about what to do with it. When I finally took possession of it 6 months ago, I came to clean it out and prepare it for sale. That was my only intention. Clean, catalog, sell. Simple, straightforward. I didn't expect to find anything more significant than old furniture and forgotten belongings. I didn't expect to find the journal that would change everything I understood about my family, its history. The entries started in 1952. My grandmother was 12 years old at the time. She wrote about receiving a doll from her grandmother. Not a toy, not something a child would play with. Something old and antique and creepy even to young eyes. The doll had a porcelain face with features that seemed wrong somehow. The eyes were too knowing. The smile was too fixed. The hands were jointed in ways that human hands shouldn't be jointed. My grandmother wrote that she immediately hated the doll, but her family insisted she keep it. They said it was a family heirloom. They said it had belonged to her great-grandmother and her great-great-grandmother before that. They said it was valuable and precious and deeply important to their family, its history. But they never explained why. The entries from 1952 were innocent enough. My grandmother wrote about her school days and her friends and normal childhood concerns. But scattered throughout the early entries were mentions of the doll. Small mentions at first. Notes that the doll was sitting in a different position in her room even though she hadn't touched it. Notes that she could swear she heard it moving at night. The terrible sound of jointed limbs shifting and changing position in the darkness. Notes that she found scratches on her bedroom door that hadn't been there before. Then came the entries about the fear. By 1953, my grandmother's handwriting had changed. It became more erratic, more desperate. She wrote about not sleeping because she was terrified of what the doll would do while she was unconscious. She wrote about waking up to find the doll standing directly beside her bed, close enough that she could have reached out and touched its porcelain face if she had the courage. She wrote about her parents dismissing her concerns, telling her she was being hysterical, that dolls couldn't move, that she was just having nightmares and letting her imagination run away with her. But it wasn't her imagination. In one entry from December 1953, my grandmother described finding scratches all over her skin when she woke up. Long scratches, deep scratches, scratches that formed deliberate patterns like words or symbols carved into her flesh while she slept. She wrote that she didn't remember being scratched. She had no memory of anything happening during the night. But the scratches were real. The blood was real. The terrifying, unsettling knowledge that something had happened to her while she was completely vulnerable and unconscious was absolutely real. When she showed the scratches to her parents, they became angry. Not concerned, angry. They insisted that she had scratched herself in her sleep. They told her to stop spreading lies about the family heirloom. They told her that if she couldn't be trusted with something as precious as the doll, they would have to consider her unstable and potentially dangerous. The implication was clear. If she kept complaining about the doll, she would be the one blamed for being mentally unbalanced. She would be the problem. The doll would be protected. So she stopped telling anyone about the terrifying things that were happening to her. Instead, she started writing in the journal, private confessions of a terrified child trapped in a house with something that was slowly terrorizing her. She wrote about how the doll's expression seemed to change, how the smile would become wider and more menacing, how the eyes would seem to track her movements around the room, how she would find it in different positions, different rooms, always closer than before, always watching, always waiting. She wrote about the thing that happened on her 15th birthday. The entry is dated March 1956. Her handwriting is almost illegible, shaking so badly that the words seem to vibrate on the page. She wrote that she had locked the doll in a closet. She had gathered every ounce of courage she possessed and had physically moved the doll into the closet in her room and had locked the door. It was a rebellion, an act of defiance against her family, against the thing that was slowly destroying her mind and her sanity. That night, the doll had moved back onto her bed. Not just moved, positioned deliberately so that it was lying beside her, as close as a human would lie beside her in bed. She had felt something brush against her skin in the darkness. She had felt cold, impossible fingers touching her face. She had felt the doll breathing somehow, even though dolls don't breathe. When she finally found the courage to turn on the light, she found the doll lying beside her with that terrible fixed smile somehow seeming even more menacing than before. My grandmother had left home 4 months later. She moved to Boston and never returned to Springfield. She never spoke about the doll to anyone. She never retrieved it from her family home. She simply fled and tried to rebuild her life in a place where she could pretend that terrifying experience had never happened. But the doll followed her in other ways. Through dreams, through nightmares that would leave her gasping and covered in sweat, through the knowledge that her family still possessed it, that her siblings were now experiencing the same terrifying phenomenon she had experienced, that the thing was spreading its corruption through her entire bloodline like a disease. She wrote about her children experiencing disturbing dreams. She wrote about strange scratches appearing on their skin. She wrote about her son becoming deeply depressed and eventually ending his own life at age 23. She wrote about never being able to fully escape the psychological damage inflicted by what she had experienced at that age. And then the entries stopped. The last entry I found was dated 1989. My grandmother was nearly 50 years old. She wrote that she had discovered that the doll was no longer in her family's home in Illinois. It had been sold. A collector had purchased it and had donated it to a museum in Key West, Florida. The East Martello Museum. The doll had become what locals called Robert the Doll, a famous haunted object that attracted ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts from around the world. My grandmother wrote that she felt a strange mixture of relief and terror at this discovery. Relief that the thing was finally out of her family's hands. Terror that it was now accessible to the public, that it was now famous and studied, that it had become something more than a family curse. It had become a documented paranormal phenomenon. People were visiting it. People were interacting with it. People were photographing it and writing about it and treating it like a curiosity rather than the genuinely terrifying, genuinely dangerous object that it was. The entry ended with a question that my grandmother never answered in writing. She asked whether removing the doll from the family had broken the curse or if the curse had simply found a new way to manifest. She asked whether her family was finally safe or if they were simply experiencing a temporary reprieve before the horror returned in a new form. I read that question over and over again, unable to stop myself from obsessing over it. I knew the answer already, or at least, I suspected the answer with the kind of certainty that comes from impossible coincidences and unsettling patterns that are too deliberate to be random. Because I had been having the dreams. They started about 2 weeks after I inherited the house and found the journal. Nightmares where I was a child again, locked in a bedroom with something that wore a porcelain mask. Dreams where I could feel cold fingers on my skin, tracing patterns, writing messages that I couldn't quite read. Dreams where I would wake up gasping, covered in sweat, my heart pounding with the absolute certainty that something was standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching me with predatory intent. And then I found the scratches. They appeared on my left arm about a week ago. Long scratches arranged in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. Almost like words. I have no memory of how they got there. I have no memory of hurting myself. But they were there, real and undeniable and terrifying in their inexplicability. Yesterday, I called the East Martello Museum in Key West. I told them I was researching my family history and that I had some questions about the doll they had on display. The man I spoke to was friendly enough. He confirmed that the museum did indeed have Robert the doll in its collection. He told me that Robert had been donated to the museum in 1964 by the original owner, a man named Robert Eugene Otto. He told me that the doll had been the source of countless paranormal reports and that people had been writing to the museum for decades claiming that the doll had caused them misfortune, illness, accident, and tragedy. Then he said something that made my blood go cold. He said that the original family that had possessed the doll before Robert Eugene Otto bought it was from Illinois. a prominent family from Springfield. He said the museum had received letters from that family dating back to the 1950s. Letters begging them not to display the doll. Letters describing the terrifying things it had done to family members. Letters that were clearly written by people who were genuinely terrified and who believed absolutely that the doll was evil. Letters from people named Catherine, just like me. I haven't left my apartment in Boston in 3 days. I called in sick to work. I locked all my doors and windows, even though I know that locks mean nothing to something that operates according to rules I don't. Do you understand? The scratches on my arm have gotten worse. New ones appear every morning in places I can possibly have scratched myself. They reforming words now. Deliberate words carved into my skin in the darkness while I sleep. Yesterday the scratches spelled out a name. My name, Catherine. And the most terrifying part, the most disturbing realization that keeps me awake at night, I found a new entry in my grandmother's journal this morning. An entry dated today. An entry written in handwriting that is definitely not my grandmother's handwriting. An entry that describes me. It describes my apartment in Boston. It describes the scratches on my arm. It describes how I'm feeling right now. Terrified and trapped and completely helpless against something that I can fight or flee from because it has become part of me now. It has become part of my bloodline. The entry ends with a prediction. It says that I will eventually give birth to a daughter. It says that the scratches will appear on her skin too. It says that the doll will reach across time and distance and family legacy to mark every Catherine in my line, to ensure that we all experience the same terror, the same helplessness, the same absolute certainty that something evil has claimed us as its own. The journal is still on my desk. I can see it in my peripheral vision even now, and I know without looking that there will be another new entry tomorrow, and the day after that, and forever, because the doll doesn't just haunt objects and places. It haunts bloodlines. It haunts families. It haunts every Catherine who will ever exist in my family until the end of time. It has already claimed me. The scratches are just the beginning. Blank, _ blank. Tell me this. If you discovered that your family carried a curse dating back generations, and you knew it would be passed to your children, would you have children anyway, or would you break the cycle at any cost? Comment below with your answer, because somewhere in Key West, Robert the doll is still collecting names of the families it has marked, still reaching out across time to find the next Catherine, the next victim, the next generation to add to its terrifying collection. Story 2. Cursed Portrait of the Peoria PISA Bird. I took a photograph I shouldn't have taken. That's where this all started. A single photograph of something ancient and terrifying, an image I captured thinking it was just a historical artifact, just a piece of local folklore brought to life on painted stone. But the moment I pressed the shutter button and captured that image, I felt something shift in the world. I felt something ancient and hungry acknowledge my presence, and I've been being hunted ever since. My name is Daniel. I am a historical documentarian. 39 years old. I travel around the United States researching local legends and Native American history, creating content for museums and educational platforms. I pride myself on being thorough and respectful when I work with sacred sites and culturally significant locations. I do my research. I get permission. I follow proper protocols. I thought I understood the difference between respectful documentation and desecration. I was catastrophically wrong. I came to Peoria, Illinois about 4 months ago to document the legend of the Piasa bird for a museum exhibition about Native American mythology. The Piasa bird is a creature from Illini tribal history, an enormous dragon-like thing with wings and teeth and an appetite for human flesh. According to the legend, the bird was so terrifying and so powerful that it could snatch people from riverbanks and carry them away to devour them. The Illini had finally managed to poison it, and then they painted its image on a bluff along the Illinois River as a warning. A permanent record, a memorial to something that had been conquered but never forgotten. The painted bluff had been destroyed and repainted many times over the centuries. But the image remained essentially the same. A massive, monstrous creature with leathery wings spread wide and teeth bared in an eternal snarl. A creature frozen in an attitude of predatory hunger. A curse painted in pigment and maintained by generations of people who understood that some images needed to exist as warnings. The current version of the Piasa bird painting stands on a limestone bluff overlooking the Illinois River. It is enormous, nearly 50 feet tall. The wings spread across nearly 100 feet of rock face. It is visible from boats on the river, visible from the roads nearby, a terrifying and ancient presence that dominates the landscape. I arrived at the site on a clear October morning, ready to document it for the museum, completely unprepared for what would happen when I looked directly into the creature's eyes. The painting itself is disturbing. The artist who created it understood predatory psychology. The bird, this expression captured something genuinely terrible. The eyes held intelligence and malice and hunger. The mouth gaped open, revealing teeth that looked like they could tear through flesh and bone with terrible ease. The overall effect was nightmarish. Looking at it made my stomach tighten with instinctive fear, the kind of primitive terror that comes from ancient parts of the human brain that recognize predators. I set up my equipment. I had professional photography gear and high-resolution cameras designed to capture detail. I wanted to document not just the image but the context, the surrounding landscape, the river below, the carved stone itself with all its texture and weathering and age. I worked methodically, taking dozens of photographs from different angles, different distances, different lighting conditions. That is when I saw it move. I was adjusting the angle on one of my cameras when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Just a slight shift, a flutter of something that might have been a wing. I looked up from my equipment, and for just a moment, I could have sworn that the painted bird, its wings were spread wider than they had been before. The position was different. The angle of the head was different, like the image on the rock had changed while I wasn't looking directly at it. I told myself it was an optical illusion. I told myself that the changing light and shadows created the impression of movement. I forced myself to continue working. I photographed the specific area where I thought I had seen the movement. And then I made my mistake. I looked directly into the creature's eyes and pressed the shutter button. I captured the face of the piazza bird in perfect detail, frozen in the moment. Immortalized, documented. That is when I felt it. A presence. Something vast and old and incomprehensibly hungry acknowledging my presence. It felt like a pressure in the air. Like the atmosphere had become thicker and heavier. I stepped back from my camera and looked up at the painting. And I swear I saw the creature. His eyes tracked my movement. I saw the gaze of that painted monster follow me as I moved. I packed up my equipment quickly. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that old stories and ancient curses were the province of superstition and folklore, not the world of rational documentation and historical accuracy. But as I was loading my car, I found myself looking over my shoulder repeatedly, unable to shake the sensation that something was watching me from the bluff, hungry, impatient, and absolutely convinced that I belonged to it now. That night, I reviewed my photographs in my hotel room. The image I had taken of the piazza bird, his face was perfect. High resolution, perfectly exposed. The detail was extraordinary. I could see individual scales on the creature. His head. I could see the predatory intelligence in those painted eyes. I could see something else too, something that made my breath catch in my throat. There was a shadow in the creature, his mouth, a darkness deeper than the painted shadows on the rest of the image. A void that seemed to extend infinitely back into the stone itself. And as I looked at that shadow, I became absolutely certain that I was looking at something real. Not paint, not artistic interpretation, an actual opening, a throat, a gullet. Something living rendered in pigment and stone. I couldn't sleep that night. I told myself it was just a trick of digital photography, some artifact of compression or lighting. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I knew that I had photographed something that existed outside normal reality, something ancient and terrifying that had been waiting on that bluff for centuries. The dream started the next night. In the dreams, I was standing on the bluff looking out at the Illinois River. But the landscape was wrong. The trees were different, the river flowed backward, and the piazza bird was alive. I could hear it breathing. I could smell its breath, which smelled like copper and decay and things that had been digested. It would turn its head slowly to look at me, and those painted eyes would become real eyes, filled with consciousness and hunger. And then I would run, knowing that I was being hunted, knowing that something was chasing me through a landscape that kept shifting and changing. I would wake up gasping, my heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that the dream was real in ways that waking life wasn't. That the dreams were actually happening somewhere, in some other reality that was just as valid as this one. The marks appeared on my body about a week after I visited the bluff. They started as small scratches on my shoulders, thin lines that looked like claw marks but that I had no memory of receiving. I told myself I had gotten them in my sleep, that I was scratching myself unconsciously due to stress. But the marks kept appearing, and they kept forming patterns, scratches that looked deliberate, intentional, like something was trying to write a message on my skin. I started documenting the marks with photographs. Each morning, new scratches would appear. Each day, they seemed to form more coherent patterns. By the third week, the pattern was undeniable. The scratches were spelling words. Terrifying words. Words like hunger and coming in debt. The nightmares got worse. They became less like dreams and more like memories. I found myself experiencing them with perfect clarity, with all the sensory detail of waking experience. I would be running through primordial forests where creatures watched me from the trees. I would be standing on riverbanks watching massive shadows move beneath the water. I would be inside caverns carved into bluffs, surrounded by ancient paintings of monsters and predators and things that existed to hunt human beings. And in all these places, something was chasing me. Something that wore the shape of the piazza bird. Something that was getting closer with each dream. Growing more real, more present, more determined to catch me and drag me away to some terrible place where I would be consumed. I went back to the bluff. I don't. Do you know why? Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me not to return. But something was pulling me back. A compulsion I couldn't resist. A hunger that wasn't my own, but that I was experiencing as if it were happening inside my own chest. I drove to the bluff on a November afternoon when the light was already beginning to fade, and I climbed the path that led to the viewing area where tourists could see the painted creature. The piazza bird was different. The image seemed darker somehow. The colors more vivid and sinister. And the eyes, those terrible eyes were looking directly at me. Not at me as a random observer, but at me specifically. With recognition and possession and absolute certainty of ownership, I took out my camera. I done. Do you know what I intended to do? I done. Do you know if I was planning to confront whatever was happening or if I was simply compelled to document it, as if photographing something could somehow give me power over it? But as I raised the camera, the light changed. It became twilight instantly. Not gradually. Not naturally. The sun simply vanished, and the world became dark and eerie and wrong in ways that violated the laws of physics and time. And in that darkness, the piazza bird began to move. It stepped out of the rock face. I watched in absolute horror as a three-dimensional creature emerged from the painted surface, wings unfurling, massive body pulling free from stone as if the painting was simply a doorway that the real thing had been waiting behind. It was enormous, so much larger than the painting suggested. Its breath became a wind that knocked me backward. Its eyes glowed with an intelligence that was utterly inhuman and utterly hungry. I ran. I threw my camera aside and sprinted down the path toward my car, terror overwhelming every other thought in my head. Behind me, I could hear the creature pursuing. I could hear the sound of massive wings beating the air. I could hear a screaming sound that might have been the wind or might have been something alive and furious. I made it to my car and drove away without looking back. When I checked my mirror miles later, I saw nothing but darkness. No pursuing creature, no physical evidence that anything supernatural had happened. Just the normal world continuing on as if I hadn't just experienced something that shattered every rational understanding of reality. But the creature is still hunting me. That was 4 months ago. I moved to a new city. I changed my phone number. I tried to disappear. But the dream's haven, stopped. And the marks on my body keep appearing, growing more numerous, covering more skin, spelling out longer and longer messages. Messages about debt and payment and the price for looking into the eyes of something ancient and sacred that was never meant to be photographed. I can feel it getting closer. I can feel its presence at the edge of my existence, waiting for the moment when my defenses fail completely. I know what is going to happen eventually. I am going to have a dream, and I am not going to wake up from it. I am going to step into that primordial landscape where the piazza bird hunts, and I am going to be trapped there forever, hunted eternally by something I should never have disturbed. The photograph is still on my hard drive. I tried to delete it multiple times, but it keeps reappearing. It is spreading to other devices. It's showing up in folders where I didn't put it. And everyone who has seen the photograph has reported the same thing. Nightmares, marks on their skin, the terrible feeling of being hunted by something impossibly large and incomprehensibly ancient. I am trying to warn you, trying to tell you that some things shouldn't be documented. Some images shouldn't be captured. Some curses are real and they reliving and they looking for anyone foolish enough to disturb them. The piazza bird is real. It is not just folklore or legend or artistic expression. It is a predator that was painted on a bluff as a warning and a cage. And I've broken that cage. It is coming for me. And when it is finished with me, it's going to come for anyone who ever sees that photograph. Tell me this. If you discovered that an ancient curse was spreading through a photograph you had seen, would you warn others about it or would you try to contain it by staying silent? Write your answer in the comments, because somewhere along the Illinois River, the Piasa bird is free now, and it is hungrier than it has ever been. It has had a taste of modern flesh, and it is going to want more. Story 3. Keys in the hallway. The sound of jangling keys echoing through an empty hospital at 3 in the morning is enough to stop your heart. Especially when you are the only person with keys to the building, and those keys are sitting in your pocket. I am a maintenance supervisor for the Illinois Department of Human Services. My name is Sarah. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 6 months I've been responsible for the upkeep of the Old Chester Mental Health Center in Southern Illinois. The place closed in 2018 after operating for nearly 150 years. And now my job is to keep the building secure while the state decides what to do with the property. It is lonely work. Night shifts in a sprawling complex of abandoned wards and treatment facilities. But the pay is solid and I needed the fresh start after my divorce. The locals warned me about the place before I took the job. Chester has a reputation. Stories passed down through generations of families who worked at the hospital or had relatives committed there. They told me about Warden Michael Brennan, who ran the facility from 1948 to 1963 with an iron fist and a taste for cruelty that made him legendary in the worst possible way. They said he still walks the corridors, his keys jangling on his belt, checking cells and making sure no patient ever escapes his eternal watch. I didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in anything I couldn't see or touch or fix with the right tools. So when they told me those scary stories, I smiled and nodded and figured they were just trying to spook the outsider, the woman from Chicago who didn't understand small-town Illinois culture. Then I heard the keys, and everything I thought I knew about reality shattered like glass. It happened during my second week. I was checking the water damage in Ward C, the oldest section of the hospital, built in 1875. The building smelled of mold and decay, its walls covered in peeling paint that revealed layer after layer of institutional colors, pale green, dull gray, that specific shade of cream they used in every government building. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating barred windows and steel doors with small observation slots, the kind you see in movies about asylums. I was alone, completely alone. The nearest town was 3 miles away, and I locked every entrance behind me as I entered. My radio sat clipped to my belt, silent except for occasional static. The building was quiet except for the usual sounds. Wind through broken windows, water dripping somewhere in the walls, the settling and creaking of old wood and stone. Then I heard them. Keys, jangling rhythmically, metal on metal, accompanied by heavy footsteps on the floor above me. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone making rounds, checking rooms one by one. The sound moved from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped directly above where I stood. My hand went to my own keys, still in my pocket. My radio showed no alerts, no indication that anyone else was in the building. But those footsteps were real, those keys were real, and they were close enough that I could hear individual keys clicking against each other, could count the rhythm of the steps. I called out, asked if anyone was there. My voice echoed through the empty ward, bouncing off walls and disappearing into darkness. No response, just silence. Then the footsteps started again, moving away, the keys jangling with each step, fading as whoever or whatever carried them moved to a different section of the building. I ran, abandoned my inspection, left equipment behind, and ran for the nearest exit with my heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself it was pipes, thermal expansion causing metal to clink and clank. I told myself the footsteps were my imagination, my mind creating patterns from random sounds. But I knew better. I worked in old buildings my entire career, knew every sound they made, and those keys were being carried by something that walked on 2 feet. The next night, I brought a voice recorder and 3 additional flashlights. If something was walking those halls, I wanted evidence, wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I returned to Ward C and waited, sitting in the dark with my recorder running, listening to the building breathe around me. The keys started at exactly 3:15 in the morning. Same rhythm, same heavy footsteps, but this time they were on my floor, coming from the far end of the hallway. I watched the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting through it, illuminating nothing but empty corridor and locked doors. But the sound kept coming closer, steady and unhurried, accompanied by something new. A low humming, tuneless and disturbing, like someone who had forgotten how songs worked but remembered the act of singing. I stood frozen as the sounds passed within 10 feet of where I crouched. The temperature dropped so dramatically I could see my breath. The keys jangled loud enough to hurt my ears, and the humming resonated in my chest like bass from speakers. But my flashlight revealed nothing. The hallway remained empty. The sounds had no source. Then they stopped. Right next to me, I felt something there, a presence so powerful it made my skin crawl. The air felt thick, pressing against me like invisible hands. And I smelled something, old leather, tobacco, and beneath it something worse, something chemical and sweet like embalming fluid. My recorder captured everything. When I played it back later, those keys were unmistakable, as was the humming and the heavy breathing that accompanied them. But the truly chilling part was what the recorder picked up that I hadn't heard in the moment. A voice, low and rough, speaking words just at the edge of comprehension. I sent the audio to a friend who does sound engineering, had him clean it up and isolate the voice. When he called me back, he sounded shaken. The voice was saying patient numbers, calling them out one by one, checking a roll call of people who had been dead for decades. And after each number, there was a different sound. A door opening, footsteps entering, then screams. Brief, terrified screams that cut off abruptly, followed by that door closing again. I researched Warden Michael Brennan, spent hours digging through archives at the Chester Public Library and online databases. What I found was horrifying. Brennan had been a brutal administrator, known for his disturbing treatment of patients and his belief that severe mental illness required severe correction. Under his watch, the hospital had one of the highest mortality rates in the state. Patients died from neglect, from experimental treatments that amounted to torture, from punishment cells where they were left in darkness for weeks. But the official records only told part of the story. I found testimonies from former staff members, documented in a 1965 investigation after Brennan's death. They described him making late-night rounds, personally selecting patients for treatment sessions that no one else was allowed to witness. They talked about screams coming from the basement treatment rooms, about patients who went down there and never came back. Their files simply marked as transferred to other facilities. The investigation found evidence of at least 40 patients whose deaths were never properly recorded, people who disappeared from the hospital, this population without explanation. And all of those disappearances occurred during Brennan's night rounds, when he walked the halls alone with his keys and his absolute authority over the terrified people trapped in his care. He died in 1963, collapsed in Ward C while making his rounds. Heart attack, the death certificate said, but staff members reported something different. They found him on the floor, eyes wide with terror, his hands clutching at his throat as if someone invisible was strangling him. And standing in the hallway nearby were 3 former patients who died under mysterious circumstances years earlier, or at least that is what the night nurse swore she saw before they vanished like smoke. The hospital tried to keep operating after Brennan's death, but the haunting intensified. Staff refused to work night shifts. Patients reported being visited by a cruel figure in a warden's uniform who threatened them and made their treatment worse. The sounds of those keys became so constant, so disturbing, that multiple wards had to be closed because no one could stand working in them. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to Ward C one more time. I needed to understand what I was dealing with, needed to know if this was truly the ghost of a dead warden or something else entirely. I brought a camera this time along with my recorder, determined to capture visual evidence. The keys started at 3:15, right on schedule. But this time, instead of running or hiding, I followed them. Moved through the darkness with my camera recording, tracking the source of those sounds as they led me deeper into the ward, past patient rooms and day areas, toward the stairs that descended to the basement. The basement, where Brennan had conducted his secret treatments, where patients had disappeared, where the investigation in 1965 had found disturbing evidence of things that should never happen in a place meant to heal people. The door to the basement was rusted shut, hadn't been opened in decades according to my records. But as I approached, following those terrifying keys, I heard locks turning, metal scraping, and the door swung open by itself, revealing stairs descending into absolute darkness. The keys jangled down those stairs, and against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed. The temperature dropped with each step, until frost formed on the walls and my breath came out in thick clouds. The smell of decay grew stronger, mixed with chemicals and something else, something that reminded me of burned hair and fierce sweat. The basement was exactly what you'd imagine from a nightmare. Long corridors lined with small rooms, each containing a chair or table bolted to the floor, restraints hanging from walls, drains in the center of each room for easy cleaning. This was where the horror happened, where Brennan had brought his victims for treatment that was really torture, for corrections that were really murder. The keys stopped at the far end of the corridor. I raised my camera and flashlight, both hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them steady. And there, in the beam of my light, I finally saw him. Not a ghost, not exactly, more like a recording, a loop of trauma burned into reality. Warden Michael Brennan stood at a door, his back to me, a massive ring of keys in his hand. He was solid, real-looking, dressed in a dark uniform from the 1950s. As I watched, frozen in terror, he selected a key, unlocked the door, and entered the room. Then I heard the screaming, not from the room in front of me, but from every room. Dozens of voices, men and women, crying out in agony and begging for mercy. The doors vibrated, something pounding on them from inside, trying to get out. And down the corridor, more figures appeared, translucent and shimmering, patients in hospital gowns stumbling toward me with empty eyes and reaching hands. I ran, dropped my camera, forgot my recorder, and sprinted for those stairs. Behind me, the keys started jangling again, faster now, accompanied by running footsteps. Something was chasing me, something that breathed heavy and smelled of death. I felt hands grab at my jacket, my hair, trying to pull me back into that nightmare basement. I burst through the door and into Ward C, didn't stop running until I reached my truck in the parking lot. When I looked back, every light in Ward C was flickering on and off, and I could see a figure in one of the windows, watching me leave, a ring of keys dangling from one hand. I quit the next morning, told my supervisor the building was unsafe, structural issues that made it too dangerous for solo inspections. He didn't argue, just sighed and said it lasted longer than most. Apparently, I was the seventh maintenance worker in 3 years. The others had all quit after experiencing similar encounters, though none of them had been willing to admit what they actually seen. The state is still deciding what to do with the Chester Mental Health Center. They can sell it, nobody wants it. They can demolish it. Historic preservation laws protect buildings that old. So it just sits there, empty and waiting, while Warden Brennan continues his eternal rounds, checking on patients who died decades ago, maintaining order in a hospital that exists now only in the space between past and present. But here is what terrifies me most. My camera is still down there in that basement. I left it running when I fled, and the battery would have lasted for hours, recording everything in that corridor of horrors. The camera uploaded footage to cloud storage automatically whenever it detected motion. And 3 days ago, I received an alert on my phone. New footage uploaded from my camera. Footage recorded at 3:15 in the morning. I haven't watched it. I can bring myself to see what my camera captured. But in the thumbnail preview, I can see a figure standing in that basement corridor, facing the camera, his keys hanging from one hand. And behind him, dozens of patients stand in the doorways of those terrible rooms, all of them staring at the camera, all of them trapped forever in the moment of their worst suffering. Whatever walks the halls of Chester Mental Health Center ISN, they're just a ghost. It's an echo of cruelty so profound it created its own reality, a pocket of horror where the worst moments of that place repeat endlessly. And everyone who enters becomes part of it. Another witness to suffering that can never end, another soul marked by proximity to something that should have died but refuses to. I still hear those keys sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, jangling faintly, like they coming from very far away but getting closer. And I wonder if leaving was enough, or if by entering that basement, by following Brennan into his domain, I became connected to whatever sustains his haunting. Maybe I'm part of his rounds now, another checkpoint he needs to visit, another door he needs to check on his eternal watch. So here is what I need you to tell me. If evil is intense enough, focused enough, repeated over years and years in the same place, can it become permanent? Can cruelty carve itself so deeply into a location that it continues existing long after the cruel person is gone, feeding on memory and fear and the suffering it caused? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 4. Unquiet Graves. What I found in St. James Sag Cemetery. My phone died the moment I stepped through the iron gates, and I knew immediately that I should have listened to the warnings. The battery had been fully charged when I left my car. I had checked it before walking into the cemetery. 95%. But as soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the screen went black. Not a low battery warning, not a gradual shutdown. The phone simply died, as if someone had flipped a switch inside the device and severed its connection to power and consciousness in the modern world. I am not a paranormal investigator. I am not a ghost hunter or a believer in supernatural phenomena. I am an insurance adjuster from the Chicago suburbs who decided, on a whim, to spend a Saturday afternoon visiting one of the most notoriously haunted cemeteries in Illinois. The St. James Sag Church Cemetery sits on a quiet road in the Bridgeport neighborhood, a place where settlers and monks have been buried for hundreds of years. The cemetery is ancient, predating Chicago itself. It is a place where history sits heavy in the soil. I had read about it online. I had seen the photographs and the accounts from people who claimed to have experienced strange phenomena there. Apparitions of monks in dark robes, settlers in period clothing, electronic devices failing without explanation. I was skeptical of all of it. I thought I would visit, take some photographs, and then move on with my day, reassured by my own rational mind that supernatural activity was nothing more than imagination and folklore. I was profoundly wrong. The cemetery itself was beautiful in that unsettling way that old places often are. The graves stretched back for centuries, the oldest stones so worn that the inscriptions were almost illegible. There were ornate Victorian monuments next to simple crosses. There were family plots surrounded by iron fencing. There were areas where the ground itself seemed to have sunken, as if the earth was settling back down over the remains beneath it. The grass was meticulously maintained, which somehow made the place feel even more eerie. It was as if the living world was trying very hard to deny the dead their authority over this place. I walked deeper into the cemetery, my eyes scanning the stones, reading names and dates. I was looking for old graves, the ones from the 1800s and earlier. I was looking for the monks, or for evidence of them. I was looking for something that would confirm or deny the stories I had read. And that is when I noticed the cold spot. It was not a gradual thing. It was not a transition between warm and cold. It was like stepping from one room into another, an absolute and immediate temperature drop. My breath became visible. Vapor rose from my mouth and nose and dissipated into the chill air. I stopped walking and looked around, trying to understand what was happening. There was no wind. The trees were still. The sky above was clear. There was no physical explanation for the sudden cold. And as I stood there, trying to process what I was experiencing, I began to see them. They were not fully formed. They were like photographs that had been almost completely faded by decades of exposure to sunlight. Translucent, barely visible, but they were there. Shapes, figures, silhouettes that vaguely resembled human beings. They were moving between the graves, drifting rather than walking, their forms wavering and shifting like heat haze on a summer road. I should have run. Every rational thought in my head was screaming at me to leave this place immediately. But I was frozen, literally frozen, not by the cold, though the temperature had now dropped to the point where I could barely feel my fingers. Frozen by a kind of terrified fascination, by a compulsion to understand what I was seeing. One of the figures approached me. As it drew closer, it became more visible, more solid. I could make out details now. A dark robe, a hood that obscured the face, the form of a monk, centuries dead, choosing to manifest itself to me in a cemetery on an autumn afternoon. I tried to back away, but my feet would not move. It was as if the ground itself had become adhesive, holding me in place. The monk stopped a few feet away from me, and I felt a presence in my mind. Not words, not a voice, but a sensation of being examined, assessed, judged by something that existed in a different plane of reality than the one I inhabited. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure faded. It dissipated like smoke, becoming transparent and then invisible. The cold began to recede. My feet suddenly felt free. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might have a heart attack right there in the middle of the cemetery. I ran. I did not walk. I did not take my time documenting what I had experienced. I simply turned and ran back toward the entrance, my shoes pounding on the grass, my breath coming in panicked gasps. I did not stop running until I reached the iron gates. I stumbled through them and collapsed against the fence, my entire body shaking with a terror I could not articulate or control. It took me maybe 10 minutes to compose myself enough to walk back to my car. When I got there, I tried my phone again. Still nothing. The screen remained black. I plugged it into the car charger and waited, hoping that the battery had simply discharged for some mundane reason. But nothing happened. The phone would not respond. It was as if it had been completely drained of power in a way that had nothing to do with normal battery depletion. I drove home in a state of shock. I did not try to process what I had seen. I did not try to rationalize it or explain it. I just drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. That night, I plugged my phone into the wall charger. It had been off for hours, and I was hoping that a full charge might bring it back to life. I went to bed and waited for morning. When I woke up, the phone was on. It was working perfectly. The battery was fully charged. The time was correct. The date was correct. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for one thing. There were photographs on the phone. Hundreds of them. Photographs I had never taken. They were images of the cemetery. But they were not photographs in any conventional sense. They were images that showed what the cemetery actually was. They showed the thin veil between the living world and the world of the dead. They showed the spirits that inhabited that place, not as the vague, translucent figures I had seen, but as they truly were. Monks, settlers, children, entire families, hundreds of them, thousands of them, all trapped in that small plot of land. Their spirits unable to find peace, their consciousness locked in a cycle of endless repetition. And they were all looking at the camera, looking at me, aware that I had entered their domain, aware that I had witnessed them, aware that I had broken the barrier between the living and the dead, if only for a moment. I deleted the photographs. I told myself that the phone had malfunctioned, that the images were some kind of digital artifact, a glitch in the device that had no basis in reality. But I knew I was lying to myself. I knew what I had seen. I knew what those photographs represented. Over the following weeks, I began to experience strange phenomena in my own home. Electronic devices would malfunction. My television would turn on and off on its own. My computer would crash at random moments. My refrigerator would freeze everything inside it solid, then suddenly stop working entirely. My car's GPS would navigate me toward roads I had never heard of, places that did not exist on any map I could find. And I started seeing them, the figures from the cemetery. They appeared in the corners of my vision, just transparent enough that I could almost convince myself they were not real. But they were there, in my bedroom, in my kitchen, in the hallway outside my apartment. They were following me. They had marked me, and they wanted something from me. I tried to research the cemetery more extensively. I went to the Chicago Library and looked through old records. I found documents from the 1800s and earlier. I found the names of the monks who had been buried there. I found the names of settlers who had died in the early years of Chicago's development. I found records of deaths that should not have been possible, deaths from causes that made no sense, deaths that seemed to defy explanation. And I found something else, a pattern. Every few decades, someone would visit the cemetery and then report strange phenomena. Electronic devices would fail, apparitions would be seen, and then, a few months later, that person would disappear. They would simply cease to exist. Their apartments would be found empty. Their cars would be discovered abandoned on the sides of roads, but their bodies would never be found. It was as if they had been pulled into another dimension entirely. As if the spirits of the cemetery had dragged them down into the soil and buried them in a place where no one could ever find them. I counted at least 15 documented disappearances, possibly more. The records were spotty and incomplete, but the pattern was unmistakable. The cemetery was a gateway. The spirits that resided there were not content to haunt just the cemetery. They were actively hunting. They were actively trying to pull the living into their world. And I was their latest target. The phenomena in my apartment have escalated dramatically. The appliances no longer malfunction randomly. They malfunction deliberately. The television shows me images of the cemetery. The computer displays photographs that I never took. The refrigerator opens and closes on its own, revealing frost and ice and darkness that should not exist inside an appliance. And the figures are no longer hiding in the corners of my vision. They are becoming more bold, more solid, more real. Last night, I woke up to find a monk standing at the foot of my bed. He was no longer translucent. He was fully formed. I could see every detail of his robes. I could see the hollow darkness where his face should be, and I could feel his attention on me, his hunger, his need to pull me into the cemetery and bury me alongside all the others who had been taken before. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body would not respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own flesh, unable to do anything but watch as the monk reached out one spectral hand toward my chest. But before he could touch me, he faded. He dissipated like morning mist, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. But he will be back. I know he will be back. And next time, I do not think he will leave without taking me with him. I am writing this account because I need people to understand. The St. James Sag Church Cemetery is not just a cemetery. It is a gateway to something older and more terrible than most people can comprehend. It is a place where the boundaries between life and death have worn so thin that they are almost transparent. It is a place where spirits are not content to remain in peace but actively hunt for living beings to drag down into their darkness. Do not visit that cemetery. Do not go there out of curiosity or skepticism or a desire to experience something supernatural. Because if you do, you will mark yourself. You will open yourself to something that will follow you into your own home. You will become prey to entities that have been waiting for centuries for an opportunity to pull someone living into their world. I can feel them now, at the edges of my consciousness. I can feel the cemetery calling to me. I can feel the compulsion building inside me to go back there, to return to the iron gates, to walk into the grounds and surrender myself to whatever fate awaits me. I do not know how much longer I will be able to resist that call. My question for you is this: if you knew that a location was genuinely dangerous, that it was actively hunting for victims, would you warn others, knowing that most people would think you were insane? Or would you stay silent to protect your own credibility? Write your answer in the comments, because I genuinely do not know what the right choice is anymore. The apparitions are becoming more frequent. The call is becoming louder. I can feel my resistance weakening with each passing day. Soon, I suspect, I will no longer be able to fight the compulsion. Soon, I will find myself driving toward the cemetery, parking my car, and walking through those iron gates for a final time. And when I do, the others will be waiting. The monks, the settlers, the children, all of them trapped in their unquiet graves, desperate to drag another living being down into their eternal darkness. I do not know how much time I have left, but I wanted to tell this story while I still could, while I was still coherent enough to form words and communicate warnings. The St. James Sag Cemetery is calling, and I fear that soon I will not have the strength to refuse its call anymore. Story 5. Cursed Asylum of Jacksonville State Hospital. I woke up in a hallway I didn't recognize, wearing clothes I didn't put on, with memories that don't belong to me. That is where the horror started, not with fear, running, or supernatural manifestations. It started with the realization that I was no longer entirely myself. That something from Jacksonville State Hospital had followed me into my body and was slowly becoming more real than I was. Every day, I'm losing more of my own life and gaining more of someone else. Someone who died in those halls over 60 years ago. My name is Rebecca. I am a paranormal investigator, 37 years old. I run a podcast and YouTube channel focused on exploring abandoned buildings and documenting evidence of paranormal activity. I've investigated hundreds of locations, haunted houses, abandoned prisons, old churches where terrible things happen. I pride myself on being thorough and skeptical. I don't accept supernatural explanations easily. I look for rational causes. I document everything. I believed I was prepared for anything. I was catastrophically wrong about Jacksonville. Jacksonville State Hospital was built in 1844 on the outskirts of Jacksonville, Illinois. It was one of the first mental hospitals in America, built during an era when the treatment of psychiatric illness was primitive and cruel. Patients were warehoused there, thousands of them over the decades. Many never left. The hospital operated for over 100 years, accumulating an almost incomprehensible amount of suffering within its walls. By the 1970s, it had become a symbol of everything wrong with institutional mental health care. It was finally closed, but the buildings remained. They still stand. Massive, Victorian structures that loom over the surrounding landscape like monuments to human cruelty. I had planned to spend one night there, a single night in the main hospital building to document paranormal activity. I had assembled my equipment carefully: temperature sensors, audio recorders, video cameras, EMF detectors, everything I needed to capture evidence of the supernatural. I had filed all the proper permits. I had notified the property management company. I had told my producer exactly where I was going and when I expected to return. Everything was by the book. I arrived at the hospital at sunset. The building was enormous. 3 stories of Victorian brick and stone, with countless windows and architectural details that seemed to watch me as I approached. The main entrance had been boarded up years ago, but previous investigators had cut through the plywood, leaving an opening that led into darkness. I turned on my flashlight and stepped through the threshold into the hospital's interior. The decay was immediate and overwhelming. Plaster hung from the ceiling in long strips. The walls were covered in mold and water damage and graffiti from decades of trespassing. The air smelled like rot and chemicals and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach tighten. As I moved through the lobby, I could see abandoned furniture. A desk where administrators had once sat. Waiting room chairs arranged in neat rows, now covered in dust and debris. Everything looked like it had been abandoned suddenly, like the staff and patients had simply vanished one day and never returned. I made my way to the basement, where the most intense paranormal activity had reportedly occurred. The stairs led down into darkness that my flashlight barely penetrated. The temperature dropped with every step. By the time I reached the basement level, I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. The basement was a maze of corridors and small rooms. Some had bars on the doors. Some had restraint equipment still bolted to the walls. This was where the most severely disturbed patients had been kept. This was where the creepiest, most terrifying history of the hospital was concentrated. I began documenting. I recorded audio. I took video. I noted temperature readings that were impossible for an abandoned building. As I moved deeper into the basement, I started to hear sounds. Soft sounds at first, whispers that might have been wind through broken windows, cries that might have been animals. But as the night progressed, the sounds became clearer. They became more clearly human. They became unmistakably the sounds of suffering. I heard someone screaming in pain. I heard someone begging for help. I heard crying and moaning and the sounds of desperate people in absolute agony. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They echoed off the stone walls and multiplied until it felt like the entire building was full of suffering. Every chilling cry seemed to contain genuine anguish. Every terrifying scream seemed to carry the weight of real trauma. I moved deeper into the basement to document the source. The sound was getting louder, more intense, more focused. It seemed to be coming from a particular corridor. I moved toward it, my flashlight beam shaking in front of me. The darkness seemed to resist the light, seemed to absorb it rather than recede from it. And then I found the room. It was small and cold and utterly eerie. The walls were padded with deteriorating leather. The floor was stained with things I didn't want to examine too closely. In the center of the room was a chair. Not a comfortable chair, a restraint chair. The kind used to hold patients during procedures that were meant to treat mental illness but that had actually been torture. Straps hung from the armrests and the legs. Buckles designed to hold someone completely immobile. The screaming was coming from inside the chair. I could see vapor rising from it. I could hear the terrifying, chilling sounds of someone in absolute agony emanating from it. My rational mind knew this wasn't possible. This was a hallucination. This was some kind of psychological response to the eerie atmosphere and the horrifying history of the place. But my instinctive mind knew the truth. Something was trapped in that chair. Something was suffering. Something was in desperate need of help. I reached toward the chair without thinking. I wanted to do something. Anything to stop the suffering. My hand touched the leather padding, and the world exploded into sensation. I experienced everything at once. I experienced lying in the chair, restrained completely, unable to move or speak or do anything except endure. I experienced the procedure being performed on me. I experienced electrical current being sent through my body, burning my nerves, searing my consciousness. I experienced the terror and the pain and the absolute certainty that this was going to kill me. I experienced dying repeatedly, moment after moment, my mind fractured by the agony, my sense of self shattered by the trauma. And I experienced it from inside someone else's body. The memories weren't my memories. The pain wasn't my pain. But I was experiencing them with absolute clarity, with complete sensory detail. I was experiencing what it had been like to be a patient in Jacksonville State Hospital when mental illness was treated with cruelty and fear and procedures designed to destroy the mind rather than heal it. I came back to myself screaming. I was lying on the basement floor, my body convulsing, my mind shattered by the experience I had just endured. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran through the corridors of the basement, through the hallways of the hospital, past windows and doors and the eerie shadows of abandoned furniture. I ran toward the entrance, toward the outside, toward sunlight and air and normalcy. I made it to my car and locked the doors. I sat there shaking, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. I told myself it had been a panic attack. I told myself it had been a hallucination brought on by the atmosphere and the history and my own psychological response to the place. I told myself that I needed to drive away and get professional help and never speak of what had happened. But when I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw someone else, his eyes looking back at me. I drove away from Jacksonville State Hospital, but something from that building had come with me. Over the next few days, I started to experience missing time. Hours would pass that I couldn't account for. I would find myself in different locations with no memory of traveling there. I would speak words that I hadn't intended to speak. I would find myself writing things I didn't remember writing. And the memories kept coming. Memories that belonged to someone else. A patient named Theodore who had been admitted to the hospital in 1952. A man who had been subjected to electroconvulsive therapy procedures hundreds of times. A man who had eventually taken his own life in the basement of that building because he couldn't endure the suffering anymore. Theodore, his memories were becoming my memories. His experiences were becoming more real to me than my own experiences. I would catch myself remembering things that had happened 60 years ago with perfect clarity. I would find myself speaking in a voice that wasn't quite mine, using words and phrases that belonged to a man who had been dead for decades. I went to the hospital a second time, thinking that confronting the source of the haunting would somehow break the connection. I was wrong. The moment I entered the building, I felt Theodore taking control. I could feel his consciousness pushing mine aside, like a stronger swimmer drowning a weaker one. I fought to maintain control of my own body, but it was like trying to hold back a tide. Theodore wanted to go back to the basement. Theodore wanted to return to the chair where he had suffered so much. I managed to escape before he could take complete control, but only barely. I drove back to the city with both hands on the wheel, clenching my jaw so hard my teeth felt like they might crack. I could feel him inside my mind, pacing back and forth, looking for a way to assert control, looking for a way to remake my body into his body and my life into his life. I went to a psychiatrist. I told him I was experiencing dissociative episodes and false memories. I didn't tell him about the asylum. I didn't tell him about Theodore. He prescribed antipsychotic medication and recommended hospitalization. I refused. I know what hospitalization means. I know that locked wards and forced treatment will only weaken my ability to resist. Theodore is waiting for something exactly like that. He is waiting for me to be vulnerable and helpless and unable to resist as he takes complete control. The integration is accelerating. I'm losing more of myself every day. This morning, I couldn't remember my mother's face. I could remember that I had a mother, but the specific details of her appearance were gone, replaced by memories of Theodore, his mother, a woman dead for 70 years. This afternoon, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize my own reflection. For a moment, I saw Theodore, his face, older, damaged, haunted by the terrible things he had experienced. And then I saw my own face again, but it was like looking at a stranger. I know what is going to happen eventually. I know that Theodore is going to win this internal battle. I know that I am going to wake up one morning and discover that I can no longer access my own memories. That my personality has been completely overwritten. That my body belongs to a man who died in the basement of Jacksonville State Hospital and who has been waiting for over 60 years for someone foolish enough to reach out and touch the chair where he suffered. They tried to research Theodore. They found old hospital records. They discovered that Theodore Eugene Hollister was admitted in 1952 at the age of 34. He was diagnosed with severe depression and paranoid delusions. He was subjected to 387 electroconvulsive therapy procedures over 18 months. He attempted suicide twice during his hospitalization. He eventually succeeded in 1963, hanging himself in the basement tunnel system. But he never actually left the building. Every investigator who has reported visiting Jacksonville State Hospital and making physical contact with the equipment or the walls has reported changes afterward. Changes in their personality, changes in their memories, changes that suggest something is slowly replacing them from the inside out. The hospital isn't just haunted. It is infected. It is full of patients who never received treatment, never received healing, never received anything except cruelty and trauma and the slow dissolution of their minds. They were waiting for visitors. They were waiting for someone to touch something that reminds them of their suffering. And when someone does, they pull that person back with them into the darkness, back into the basement, back into that terrible building where they can finally have company in their endless torment. I can feel Theodore getting stronger. I can feel him learning my memories, studying my life, preparing to completely replace me. Soon I won't to exist anymore. I'll just be memories someone else is viewing from a distance, fading like old photographs until they be too unclear to see. Jacksonville State Hospital is still there. The building still stands. The basement is still full of screaming that most people can to hear. And the chairs are still waiting for someone to touch them, someone to make contact, someone to break the barrier between their world and ours and let the patients who suffered there finally have what they've been desperate for over all these decades. They want witnesses. They want someone to remember what happened to them. They want someone to finally acknowledge their suffering. They want me, blank, underscore, blank. Tell me this. If you discovered that a piece of your identity had been replaced by someone else, and you could still perceive what was happening but couldn't stop it, at what point would you stop fighting and accept the inevitable? Write your answer in the comments. Because somewhere in Jacksonville, Illinois, the state hospital is still standing. And if you ever go inside those walls, if you ever touch one of those restraint chairs or feel the suffering emanating from the basement, just remember, the patients there have been waiting a very long time, and they were always hungry for new company. Story 6. Soul Eater of Cairotown Ruins. I can't feel happiness anymore. That is the first symptom, though I didn't know it was a symptom at the time. I went to Cairo, Illinois about 3 months ago, and I've been getting progressively numb ever since. Not depressed, not grieving, numb, like something reached inside my chest and carefully removed the part of me that is capable of joy. The part of me that knows how to feel anything except fear and cold and an overwhelming sense of emptiness that grows more profound every single day. My name is James. I am a history teacher, 41 years old. I teach at a high school in southern Illinois, just 20 miles from Cairo. For years, I've been fascinated by the town, not in a casual way, in the way you become obsessed with something dark and disturbing that you can't quite look away from. Cairo was once a thriving river town, important and prosperous and alive. But it had been abandoned, left to decay, transformed into a ghost town that tourists avoided and locals refused to acknowledge. I became determined to document the history of the place, to create an educational resource about how and why entire American communities can simply die. That obsession was a mistake. Cairo sits at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers in southern Illinois. It was founded in 1816 and grew rapidly into a prosperous port city. Riverboats came and went, merchants thrived, families established businesses and built homes and created a community. But underneath all that prosperity was something dark. Cairo was a border town between North and South, between slavery and freedom, and that boundary became a source of tremendous tension and violence. The town's history is soaked in racial conflict and brutality and injustice that most people prefer to forget. By the 1970s, Cairo had begun to collapse. White residents fled to the suburbs. Businesses closed. The population plummeted from nearly 20,000 people to just a few hundred. Buildings were abandoned. Streets became desolate. And as the town died, something else seemed to wake up. Something that fed on the despair and the anger and the historical trauma that hung over the place like a curse. Something that the few remaining residents would only speak about in whispers, if they would speak about it at all. The Soul Eater. That's what they called it. I first heard the term from a man named Henry who ran a small grocery store on Cairo, South Main Street. I had come to buy supplies before exploring the ruins, and Henry had taken one look at me and asked why I was there. When I explained that I wanted to document the town, its history, he had gone very quiet. He had set down the item he was stocking and had looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or pity, or both. He told me that Cairo wasn't the place you just visited for historical research. He told me that the town had a presence, a consciousness. He said that over the years, too much suffering had accumulated there. Too much injustice, too much pain that had never been resolved or acknowledged or healed. That pain had to go somewhere, he said. It had crystallized into something real, something that was hungry. I asked him what he meant by hungry. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he told me stories. He told me about a researcher who had come to Cairo 5 years ago to study the town, its decline. The man had disappeared. His car was found parked near the ruins, but he was never located. His family eventually had to accept that he was gone, though they never found a body or any explanation for his disappearance. He had simply ceased to exist. Henry told me about a photographer who had come to document the abandoned buildings. She had completed her project and had left town, but something had followed her. According to Henry, she had developed severe depression about a month after leaving Cairo. She had stopped eating. She had stopped going to work. She had spent all her time sitting in her apartment, staring at nothing, complaining that she couldn't to remember what joy felt like. Within 6 months, she had taken her own life. He told me about teenagers from the area who had gone to explore the Cairo ruins for kicks. Some of them had come back different, quieter, darker. They had spoken about feeling something in those abandoned buildings, something that had tried to take something from them, something that had partially succeeded. I listened to these stories and told myself they were just folklore, urban legends, the kind of scary stories that any small town accumulates over the years. I didn't believe in malevolent presences or supernatural entities that could extract something essential from human consciousness. I believed in documented history and rational explanation. I believed that Cairo's problems were the result of economics and politics and historical circumstance, not haunting or curses or things that fed on despair. Henry had looked at me with an expression of resignation when I insisted that I wanted to proceed with my research anyway. He had said nothing else, but as I left the store, I heard him whisper something under his breath. I think he said, "It's always hungry." I spent the first day documenting the exterior of the abandoned buildings. I photographed the crumbling facades of hotels and banks and government buildings. I walked streets where, less than 50 years ago, hundreds of people would have been going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their community was approaching its death. The emptiness was profound. It was the kind of emptiness that makes you feel small and temporary. The kind of emptiness that whispers that nothing matters and that everything eventually falls apart. By evening, I had filled half a notebook with observations and hundreds of photographs. I was feeling satisfied with my progress, thinking that my fears about the town had been overblown. I drove to a motel just outside of Cairo and settled in for the night, planning to explore the interior of the buildings the next day. That's when I first noticed the numbness. I was lying in the motel bed trying to sleep, and I realized that I couldn't remember the last time I had felt excited about something. I had spent years planning this research trip. I had been passionate about it, but lying there in that dark motel room, the emotion felt distant and unreachable. I could remember that I had been excited, but I couldn't access the feeling itself. It was like looking at a photograph of something you once loved and feeling nothing. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself it was the stress of the day and the unfamiliar surroundings. I forced myself to sleep. The dream started immediately. In the dream, I was walking through Cairo, but it was Cairo as it had been decades ago. The buildings were intact and vibrant. The streets were full of people, but something was wrong with the vision. The colors were too saturated. The sounds were too loud. The experience was too intense. It felt less like a dream and more like watching something real through a distorted lens. I was walking through the town, and I became aware that something was following me. I couldn't see it directly, but I could feel its presence behind me, just outside my field of vision. A shadow, a void, something that was drinking in the environment around it, consuming the life and the joy and the prosperity that the dream Cairo contained. Everywhere it passed, the buildings seemed to decay just a little bit more. The people seemed to fade just a little bit further. The colors drained away and were replaced by shades of gray. I tried to run, but I was moving in slow motion. The thing behind me was getting closer. I could hear it breathing now, a sound like wind moving through abandoned buildings. And then it touched me, and the dream ended. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding, my body covered in cold sweat. It was 3 a.m, and I couldn't fall back asleep. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something had stolen something from me while I was sleeping. The next day, I forced myself to continue with my research. I went into one of the largest abandoned buildings, a 6-story structure that had once been a hotel. The interior was a maze of deteriorating corridors and rooms frozen in time. Furniture still sat in some of the rooms, covered in decades of dust. Personal items were still scattered around, forgotten by people who had left in a hurry decades ago. I moved through the building slowly, documenting everything, taking photographs, making notes. But as I moved deeper into the building, I became aware of something. The shadows seemed wrong. They were too dark, too defined, too aware. I would turn a corner and see a shadow that seemed to be shaped like something watching me. I would enter a room and feel immediately that something had been there moments before, that I had just missed something by seconds. And the numbness was getting worse. By the time I reached the top floor of the hotel, I couldn't remember what my family looked like. I could remember that I had a sister and that I loved her, but when I tried to picture her face, there was just blankness. The memory was there, but the emotional content had been stripped away. It was like someone had carefully extracted every feeling I had ever had about the people I cared about most. I left the building and drove back to the motel, terrified in a way I couldn't fully articulate. That night, I made reservations to leave Cairo the next morning. I told myself that I had gotten enough material for my project. I told myself that I needed to process what I had learned before coming back. I told myself that I wasn't running away from something terrifying and supernatural. I was lying to myself. That night, the dream returned, but this time I was aware during the dream that I was dreaming. I was aware that something was in the dream with me, a presence that was vast and hungry and patient. It didn't look like anything. It didn't have a form. It was simply an absence, a void in the shape of something that consumed everything it touched. And it was coming for me. I tried to wake up, but I couldn't. The dream held me prisoner, and the void came closer and closer, and with every inch it advanced, something else was stripped away from me. Not memories, capabilities, the ability to love, the ability to feel pride, the ability to care about anything except my own survival. When I finally managed to wake up, I was screaming. I left Cairo immediately. I got in my car at dawn and drove without stopping for 6 hours, just trying to put distance between myself and that terrifying town. But the numbness didn't leave with me. If anything, it got worse. 3 months later, I'm a shell. I teach my classes, but I go through the motions without feeling any connection to the material or the students. I've tried to maintain relationships with friends and family, but I can to access the emotions that relationships require. My ex-wife called me last week, and when she told me she was getting married, I felt nothing. No happiness for her, no regret for myself, just an empty, hollow indifference. I know what happened to me in Cairo. I know that something in that cursed town reached into my chest and removed the parts of me that make me human. I know that I am gradually being drained of everything that matters. And the most terrifying part is that I can feel it continuing. Even here, hundreds of miles away, I can feel the presence of the soul eater pulling at me, draining me, extracting my essence piece by piece. I started researching what happened to Cairo. I found documentation about the racial violence that had occurred there. I found photographs of burned buildings and accounts of riots and hatred and murder that had soaked into the soil of that town for over 100 years. All that suffering, all that injustice, all that pain had to go somewhere. It had to accumulate somewhere. And it had chosen to become something living, something that fed on the only renewable resource such a place had left, the despair of visitors. I've become convinced that I need to go back. That going back is the only way to end this. But I'm terrified of what will happen if I return. I'm terrified that the soul eater will take the last of what remains of me. And even more terrifying is the knowledge that there is a part of me that wants to go back. A compulsion that is getting stronger every day. A voice that whispers that perhaps it would be better to simply surrender to the void, to let the consuming darkness take everything that is left, to stop fighting something that is inevitable. Cairo is still there, the ruins still stand, the soul eater still waits, and it is always hungry. Blank, _ blank, tell me this. If you felt something essential being slowly extracted from your soul, something you couldn't see or fight or escape, would you return to face it or would you let it consume you from a distance? Write your answer in the comments. Because somewhere in southern Illinois, the abandoned town of Cairo is waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to enter its ruins. And the soul eater is always ready to feed. Story 7, room 441. The woman in black was standing at the foot of my bed when I woke up at 3 in the morning. Not floating, not transparent, just standing there in a Victorian dress, staring at me with eyes that reflected my bedside lamp like an animal, his eyes caught in headlights. I am a sales representative for a medical supply company. My name is David. I am 52 years old, and I travel the Midwest visiting hospitals and clinics. I've stayed in hundreds of hotels over my 20-year career, from luxury chains to roadside motels that barely pass inspection. I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. The Congress Plaza Hotel in Chicago became my regular stop 3 years ago. It's a historic landmark on South Michigan Avenue. Built in 1893 for the World S Fair, all ornate architecture and old world charm. The rates were reasonable, the location perfect for my client visits, and the staff friendly. The first dozen times I stayed there, nothing unusual happened. Just a comfortable room, decent sleep, and early checkout for morning meetings. Then they upgraded me to the 4th floor, room 441. The desk clerk apologized for the inconvenience, said my usual room was being renovated, but this was actually a nicer accommodation at no extra charge. She handed me the key card with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I should have noticed that. Should they ask why a nicer room was available when the hotel was supposedly fully booked? The room looked normal when I first entered. King bed, desk, bathroom, the standard hotel setup. But the air felt wrong, heavy and cold despite the thermostat reading 72 degrees. And there was a smell, faint but disturbing, like flowers left too long in a vase. That sickly sweet rot of dying plants mixed with old perfume. I unpacked, worked on my laptop for a few hours, ordered room service. Everything seemed fine until I tried to sleep. The moment I turned off the lights, the temperature dropped at least 15 degrees. I pulled up the extra blanket from the closet, but the cold wasn't normal cold. It was penetrating, bone deep, the kind of chill that makes your teeth chatter no matter how many layers you pile on. Then I heard the sounds. Footsteps in the hallway outside my door, pacing back and forth, for hours. But when I looked through the peephole, the corridor was empty. I heard crying, a woman sobbing somewhere nearby, the sound muffled like it was coming through walls. And underneath everything, a low humming that vibrated through the floor and made the water glass on my nightstand ripple. I finally fell asleep around 2 in the morning, exhausted despite the eerie disturbances. That is when she appeared. The woman in black, standing perfectly still at the foot of my bed, her Victorian dress buttoned high at the neck, her dark hair pulled back severely. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the darkness, and her eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe properly. My body was paralyzed, locked in place by fear so profound it shut down every system except sight. I could only watch as she slowly raised one hand and pointed at me, her finger trembling slightly, her mouth opening as if to speak but making no sound. Then she vanished, not gradually, not fading away, just gone in an instant like she had never been there at all. My body unlocked, and I gasped air, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. I turned on every light in the room and sat in the desk chair until dawn, too terrified to close my eyes again. At checkout, I asked the desk clerk about the woman, described her carefully, mentioned the 4th floor, watched her face go carefully neutral. She told me the hotel was old, lots of history. Sometimes guests had vivid dreams in unfamiliar surroundings. But I saw her exchange a glance with another staff member, saw the way they both looked uncomfortable, and I knew they heard this story before. I should have switched hotels. They requested a different room at minimum. But I had a big presentation that week, deadlines and stress and too much on my mind. When I returned to Chicago 2 weeks later, I specifically requested a room on a different floor. They gave me the 3rd floor, room 328, and I thought I was safe. The nightmares started immediately, not just dreams, but horrifying visions so vivid I'd wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat. I dreamed of the 4th floor, of room 441, of a woman in black standing over sleeping men and reaching down with pale hands. In the dreams, I could see her touching their faces, their throats, and I could feel their terror, their inability to move or fight back, their desperate need to breathe as invisible pressure closed around their windpipes. I researched the hotel, its history, spent hours digging through old newspaper archives and ghost hunting websites. What I found made my blood run cold. The Congress Plaza Hotel is one of the most haunted locations in Chicago, with documented paranormal activity going back decades. And room 441 is the epicenter, the most disturbing room in the entire building. The stories all followed the same pattern. Male guests checking into that room, experiencing the same things I had. The cold, the sounds, the woman in black appearing at the foot of their beds. But some men reported worse encounters. They described waking up unable to breathe, feeling hands around their throats, being held down by an invisible force. Some had been found unconscious, scratches on their necks, unexplained bruising around their windpipes. Hotel security had responded to multiple emergency calls from that room over the years. The woman in black was identified in several accounts as Peg Leg Johnny, his captain, his wife, though the details varied. Some said she died in the hotel in the early 1900s, possibly suicide, possibly murder. Others claimed she'd been a guest who was attacked by a male intruder and had died defending herself. The common thread in every story was her rage toward men, her lingering presence in room 441, and her increasingly violent manifestations as the years passed. But there was more. The hotel staff whispered about an evil presence on the 4th floor, something darker than a simple ghost. They talked about shadow figures in the hallways, about elevators stopping on the 4th floor when nobody called them, opening their doors to reveal empty corridors filled with an oppressive sense of dread. They mentioned cold spots that moved, following guests, getting closer. And they described sounds, terrible sounds, that seemed to come from inside the walls, scratching, banging, voices speaking in languages nobody recognized. I tried to stay away from the Congress Plaza after that, booking rooms at other hotels when I visited Chicago. But my company had negotiated a corporate rate there, and my boss insisted I use it to save money. I was trapped, forced to return to that creepy building again and again, always requesting rooms far from the 4th floor, always dreading what might happen. The attack started on my 5th stay. I was in room 215, 2 floors below the haunted room, thinking distance would protect me. I woke up at 3 in the morning gasping for air, my hands clawing at my throat. Something was choking me, invisible hands with terrifying strength, cutting off my oxygen. I thrashed and fought, falling out of bed, crashing into furniture. When I finally broke free, when I could breathe again, I saw her standing in the corner of my room. The woman in black, but different now. Her face was twisted with rage, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hands reaching toward me with fingers bent like claws. She moved closer, gliding across the floor without walking, and the temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the windows. I grabbed my phone and ran, burst out of my room in my underwear, raced down the hallway screaming for help. Hotel security found me in the lobby, shaking and incoherent. They took me to the manager's office, gave me water, tried to calm me down. The manager was a middle-aged woman who worked at the Congress Plaza for 20 years. And when I described what happened, her expression turned grim. She knew exactly what I was talking about because she heard it dozens of times before. She finally told me the truth. The hotel was haunted, aggressively haunted, particularly toward male guests. The woman in black wasn't the only entity. She was just the most visible. There was something else on the 4th floor, something that had been there long before the hotel was built, something the building had been constructed on top of. The original land had been a burial ground, and then a hospital during the Civil War, and then a tenement where multiple deaths occurred. The Congress Plaza was built on layers of trauma and suffering, and whatever lived there had been absorbing that darkness for over a century. Room 441 was a focal point, a place where the veil between our world and whatever existed alongside it was thinnest. The woman in black appeared there most frequently, but she wasn't trapped in that room. She could move throughout the building, following people she marked, targeting men who reminded her of whoever had hurt her in life. The manager offered me a full refund and suggested I never stay at the Congress Plaza again. But she also said something that made my skin crawl. Once the woman in black had noticed me, marked me as a target, I might not be safe anywhere. She could follow me, attach herself to me, make my life hell no matter how far I ran. The hotel was just her home base, but her reach extended beyond those walls. I thought she was exaggerating, trying to scare me. I checked into a different hotel across town, a modern chain with no history, no ghosts, just clean rooms and cable television. I felt safe for exactly one night. The second night, she appeared again, standing at the foot of my bed at 3 in the morning. That same accusing stare, that same Victorian dress, but closer now. So close I could see details, the tiny buttons on her dress, the cameo at her throat, the wedding ring on her finger. She reached out and touched my foot through the blanket. Her hand was ice cold, so cold it burned, and where she touched me I felt pain like frostbite. I pulled away, scrambled to the other side of the bed, and she followed, moving around the foot of the bed with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving mine. I ran again, changed hotels again, but she kept finding me. Every city I visited, every room I stayed in, she appeared at 3 in the morning. Sometimes just watching, sometimes reaching for me, sometimes doing worse. I woke up with scratches, with bruises, with marks on my throat that looked like fingerprints. My coworkers noticed, asked if I was okay, suggested I see a doctor. How could I explain that I was being haunted by a vengeful spirit from a Chicago hotel? I consulted paranormal investigators, psychics, religious leaders, got blessings, wore protective charms, tried rituals meant to break spiritual attachments. Nothing worked. The woman in black was determined, patient, and growing more aggressive with each encounter. I felt her presence even during the day now, a cold spot that followed me, a shadow in my peripheral vision, a whisper just below hearing that made my skin crawl. Last month, I was hospitalized after being found unconscious in my hotel room in Indianapolis. The doctor said it looked like strangulation, severe enough to cause me to pass out. But the room was locked from inside, and hotel cameras showed nobody entering or leaving. The police suspected I tried to hurt myself, a mental health crisis brought on by work stress. They put me on psychiatric hold for 72 hours. I am writing this from a different hotel, my last night on the road before I quit this job. I can to do this anymore. Can to keep traveling. Can to keep staying in hotel rooms where she finds me. My wife thinks I'm having a breakdown. My boss thinks I'm unreliable. My doctor has me on medication that doesn't help because you can to medicate away a haunting. But here is what terrifies me most. I researched other guests who stayed in room 441, men who reported similar experiences. I found 3 of them through online forums and paranormal websites. All 3 are dead. One died of a heart attack at age 45. Another committed suicide, hanging himself in his garage. The third was found dead in his home, officially ruled natural causes. But his wife told me he'd been talking about a woman in black who visited him every night, who was slowly killing him through terror and exhaustion. I think next. I think the woman in black has marked me for death, and she is taking her time, enjoying my fear, feeding on my suffering. Each encounter drains me a little more, makes me weaker, more vulnerable. I barely sleep now. My heart races constantly, and I'm losing weight because the stress has killed my appetite. The sun is setting outside my window. In a few hours, it will be 3 in the morning. She'll come again. I know she will. Stand at the foot of my bed, reach for me with those frozen hands, maybe finally finish what she started. And there's nothing I can do to stop her. Nowhere I can hide. No protection that works against something that exists in the space between life and death. Room 441 at the Congress Plaza Hotel is still being rented to unsuspecting guests. The hotel hasn't closed it, hasn't even posted warnings. They just keep booking people into that cursed space, collecting their money, and letting whatever lives there prey on the vulnerable and unlucky. And for those of us who survive our stay, who escape that room only to find we haven't escaped at all, there is no help, no cure, just a slow descent into terror as something we can. The fight slowly destroys us. So here is what I need to know. What keeps me awake every night as 3 in the morning approaches? When does a haunting end? When the ghost gets bored? When the victim dies? Or is it eternal, a connection that lasts forever once it's made, binding the living and dead together in a nightmare that never stops? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 8, Push. What happens when you turn off the lights at this bridge? I felt the car move. Not rock, not sway. Move, like something solid pushed it from behind. And I knew in that moment that the urban legend was real, and I was going to die on this bridge. My name is Sarah, and I'm telling you this story because I need someone to understand what actually happens at that place in Eldon Hazlitt State Park, Illinois. I need someone to know the truth before they make the same terrible mistake I did. I need you to understand that some legends exist because people survived them and tried to warn the rest of us. And some legends exist because people didn't survive, and something else wanted to make sure we knew about it. The story about Devil's Bridge has been told in Illinois for decades. Every small town has one, some secluded location where teenagers go to test their courage. The bridge in Eldon Hazlitt State Park was ours. The legend was simple enough. You drive to the bridge at night. You turn off your headlights. You turn off your engine. You sit in complete darkness. And if you be brave enough, if you be stupid enough, the devil himself will come and push your car off the bridge and into the creek below. Most people dismissed it as nonsense. Teenagers making up stories to scare each other. Urban legend fodder, the kind of thing that gets passed around on the internet and mutates with each retelling until nobody remembers where it came from or if it ever had any truth to it at all. I thought the same thing until my husband died. His name was David. He was a good man, a rational man, an engineer who believed in facts and logic and nothing that couldn't to be measured or explained. We'd been married for 8 years. We had 2 kids, a house in the suburbs, the kind of normal, stable life that most people spend their entire existence working toward. And then, in the spring of 2019, everything changed. David went to Devil's Bridge with his friends on a Friday night. Just a guy's night out, he told me. His friend Marcus had turned 40, and they were going to celebrate with some beers and reminiscing about old times. They drove to the state park sometime around 11 in the evening. According to Marcus, David wanted to do the Devil's Bridge challenge. He wanted to park on the bridge, turn off the lights, and prove that it was all nonsense. Marcus said David was laughing about it, calling it ridiculous, acting like he was above the superstition. David was alone on the bridge when it happened. Marcus said he was waiting with the other guys in the parking area about 100 yards away. He said they heard the screaming first, this raw, primal sound of absolute terror that cut through the darkness. Then they heard the crash, a sickening crunch of metal and glass and breaking wood as David's car plunged off the bridge into the creek below. The police called it an accident. They said David must have accidentally shifted the car into neutral or knocked the parking brake loose in the darkness. They said the car rolled forward due to a slight slope on the bridge and crashed through the wooden railing. It was tragic, they said, but accidents happen, especially when people are being stupid and reckless in the dark. But I didn't believe that explanation. I couldn't believe it. Not because it was impossible, but because of what the police found when they recovered David's body. The autopsy report stated that David had defensive wounds on his hands and arms. Bruises that looked like he'd been fighting something or someone. The police said he must have been trying to grab onto something as the car went over the edge, trying to save himself. But that is not what the bruises looked like to me. I saw the photographs during the investigation. The bruises formed a pattern. They were on his back, on his shoulders, on the back of his neck. They looked like handprints, large handprints, the kind of marks that would be left if something with enormous hands had physically pushed him, shoved him with force. The police detective I spoke to seemed uncomfortable when I asked about those marks. He said they were inconclusive. He said the body had been damaged during the crash, and sometimes bruises could look like patterns that weren't really there. He strongly suggested that I accept the accident explanation and move on with my life. He said that pursuing alternative theories would only cause me more pain. But I couldn't. To move on, I became obsessed with Devil's Bridge. I started researching the legend. I found old newspaper articles from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. There were more accidents at that bridge than there were at any other location in the state park. More crashes, more deaths, more cars that seemed to have driven off the bridge under circumstances that didn't quite make sense. The official reports called them accidents, isolated incidents, statistical anomalies. But there was a pattern if you looked hard enough. A pattern of people going to Devil's Bridge, people doing the dare, and people ending up dead. I found online forums where people shared their experiences at the bridge. Most of them were skeptics, people who had done the challenge and nothing had happened. But there were others, people who felt the car move, people who heard sounds outside the vehicle, people who had seen things in the darkness, shadows that moved with intention, shapes that shouldn't exist. And then there were the posts from people whose loved ones had died at the bridge, people asking the same questions I was asking, people searching for answers that the authorities refused to provide. One post in particular stuck with me. It was from a woman named Jennifer, and she deposted it in 2015. Her sister had died at Devil's Bridge in 1998. Jennifer wrote that she visited the bridge herself, that she done the dare, and that something had definitely been there. She wrote about the overwhelming sense of presence in the darkness, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and hungry. She wrote about how the air itself had seemed to change, to become thick and oppressive, to take on a weight that shouldn't be possible. She wrote about hearing breathing that wasn't to her own and seeing a shape in the darkness that was impossibly tall and impossibly wide. Jennifer, this final paragraph haunted me. She wrote, "It is not trying to scare you away. It is not playing a game. It is testing you. It is deciding if you are worth taking. And if you fail its test, if you show the fear that it is looking for, then it will push you. It will push you right off that bridge, and nobody will ever understand what really happened to you." I obsessed over Jennifer's post. I tried to contact her, but her account had been deleted, and I couldn't find any way to reach her. It was like she'd been erased from the internet, like she deposted her warning and then vanished. That terrified me, but it also determined me. I needed to understand what had happened to David. I needed to know if my husband had encountered something supernatural, something malevolent, something that couldn't be explained by accident or coincidence. So I decided to go to Devil's Bridge myself. I made the drive to Eldon Hazlitt State Park on a warm evening in July, about 3 months after David's death. The drive took me through increasingly rural parts of Illinois, through small towns that seemed to be slowly dying, through landscapes that grew more and more isolated as I got closer to the park. The sun was setting as I drove through the park entrance, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were beautiful and deeply unsettling at the same time. The bridge was exactly as I imagined it. A stone structure, old and weathered, spanning a creek that looked dark and still in the fading light. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. The railings were made of wood, and I could see the scars where David's car had broken through. The creek below was maybe 30 feet down, flowing slow and silent through a landscape of shadows and thick vegetation. I parked on the bridge. I turned off my engine. I turned off my headlights. The darkness that descended was total and absolute. There was no moon that night. The trees around the bridge blocked out most of the stars. I sat in complete blackness, and the feeling was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, loud and harsh, echoing inside the car. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I could feel something else, a presence, something that was aware of me. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. 5 minutes of that crushing darkness and that suffocating silence and that overwhelming sense of being watched by something that existed just outside the range of my perception. My hands were shaking. My breathing was getting faster and faster, approaching hyperventilation. I was about to turn the car back on, to drive away and never come back, when I felt it. The car moved, just slightly, just enough that I could feel it. A push from the back. Not like the car had shifted or settled, like something had placed its hands on the back bumper and pressed. I turned on the engine. I turned on the headlights. I drove off that bridge at speeds that were dangerous on that narrow road, and I didn't stop driving until I left the state park entirely. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely grip the steering wheel. My mind was racing with what I experienced, trying to rationalize it, trying to convince myself that it had been the wind, or the car settling, or my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. But I knew better. I knew what had happened. I knew that something had touched my car. I knew that something had been there with me on that bridge. And I knew that David had experienced the same thing, and that whatever it was had decided to push. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I spent the next week in a state of absolute terror, replaying that moment over and over in my mind, feeling that push against the back of my car, understanding with horrifying clarity what my husband had gone through. I started researching more aggressively. I contacted paranormal investigators. I spoke to psychics. I even reached out to the local historical society to see if they had any information about the bridge that might explain what was happening there. What I learned was deeply disturbing. The bridge in Eldon Hazlitt State Park was built in 1887. But before the bridge was built, there had been a location where that creek crossed the land. A location where people had died. According to old local legends, there had been hangings at that location. A man had been hanged there in the 1800s for crimes that were either heinous or fabricated, depending on which version of the story you believed. The man had been hanged, and his body had been left to rot as a warning to others. His remains had seeped into the soil and the water, poisoning the land with violence and rage and a hunger for death. When the stone bridge was built decades later, it was built directly over that spot. And from that moment on, people started dying there. Not regularly, but periodically. A car would go off the bridge. Someone would crash into the stone structure. A person would disappear near the bridge and never be found. The deaths came in clusters, usually involving young people, usually involving people who were doing the dare, usually involving circumstances that couldn't be adequately explained. I found an article from the local newspaper dated 1952. A bridge inspection had been ordered after multiple accidents. The inspectors found nothing wrong with the bridge itself. The structure was sound. The railings were solid. There was no reason for cars to crash there. And yet the crashes continued. There was a quote in the article from the inspector, a man named Harold Finch. He said, "There is something about this location that I cannot explain. Every time I inspect this bridge, I feel watched. I feel a presence that seems almost sentient. I cannot recommend closing the bridge because there is no structural defect that would justify it. But I can tell you that this bridge has a quality to it that is deeply unsettling. I would not allow my children to cross it after dark." Harold Finch died 6 months after writing that report. A car accident on this bridge. I became convinced that something was living in that place. Not a ghost exactly, but something that had been attracted to the location by the violence and death that had occurred there. Something that fed on fear. Something that was drawn to people who came to test themselves, people who came to do the dare, people who came looking for a confrontation with something terrifying. I started keeping a journal of all the deaths at the bridge. I compiled a list of every accident, every crash, every incident that had ever occurred there going back to the 1800s. The list was long, longer than anyone would believe, and the pattern was undeniable. People came to this bridge. They challenged the legend, and then they died. I attempted to contact the state park officials. I requested that the bridge be closed or that warnings be posted about the unusual accident rate. They denied my request. They said there was no evidence of anything abnormal occurring at the bridge. They said that if I was spreading rumors about the location being cursed or haunted, I could face legal consequences for interfering with the operation of a state park. That is when I understood the full scope of the horror. This thing, whatever it was, had been operating in the same location for well over 100 years. It had killed dozens of people, maybe more, and the authorities knew about it. On some level, at some official level, the people running the park knew what was happening, and they were allowing it to continue. I made another trip to this bridge. I needed to understand what this thing was. I needed to know if there was any way to stop it. This time, I didn't do the dare. I stayed in my car with the lights and engine running, and I watched the bridge from the parking area. I sat there for hours, watching, waiting, and then I saw it in the darkness of the bridge, barely visible. I saw a shape. It wasn't tall exactly. It was wide, impossibly wide. Its form was vague and shifting, like it didn't quite exist in our normal reality. It seemed to be made of shadow and hunger and something darker than either of those things. It moved along the bridge. It looked at the parked cars. It seemed to be searching for something. Searching for someone foolish enough to turn off their lights. Someone brave or stupid enough to do the dare. I watched it for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes. Then I turned on my car and drove away. I haven't been back to this bridge since that night. I've moved my family away from Illinois. I've tried to move on with my life. But I know that thing is still there. I know that it's still waiting on that bridge. I know that more people will die there because they want to believe in the legend. They'll think they're brave. They'll think they can handle it. They'll turn off their lights, and they'll feel the push, and they'll crash through those wooden railings into the creek below. And the authorities will call it an accident. They'll file the report, close the case, and move on. Because acknowledging what is really happening at S Bridge would require them to do something about it. And something about that place seems to prevent action, seems to ensure that the deaths continue. The scariest part of this entire experience is that they learned there are other bridges like this. Other locations across America where something waits in the darkness. Where legends have been built up as warnings. Where people die regularly and officially but suspiciously. These places exist in state parks and on back roads and at the edges of small towns. They are part of the infrastructure of our country. And we drive over them and ignore them and let them take their harvest year after year. I need to ask you something now, and I need you to think carefully about your answer. Have you ever visited a place where you felt something fundamentally wrong? Where the warnings about staying away seemed to carry a weight that suggested they were rooted in truth rather than superstition? A place that felt haunted or dangerous or like it was actively trying to push you away? And if you have, Did you feel something trying to make you do the dare? Did you feel something testing whether you were brave enough or stupid enough to challenge it? Write your answer in the comments. Tell me about that place. Tell me if you felt that push. Tell me if you understood that you were being hunted by something that exists in the margins of our normal reality. Because if you have, then you know what I know. You know that devil is bridge ISN to unique. You know that the entire map of America is marked with locations like this. And you know that most people will never understand what they were really driving over or walking past or unknowingly venturing into. I just hope you survived it. Story 9. Curse of Anna State Hospital. I found my daughter, a doll, in the basement of an asylum that closed before she was born. And that is when I understood that time itself had become unreliable. The doll was unmistakable, hand-knitted by my mother in the hospital the day after Emma was born. A pink yarn doll with black button eyes and my daughter's name embroidered across the chest. A doll that had never left my house. A doll that was sitting in a locked, abandoned building 5 miles away, covered in dust and the decay of 30 years. My name is James. I am a structural engineer from Anna, Illinois, and I have spent the last 3 weeks trying to convince myself that I am experiencing a psychological breakdown rather than accepting the alternative. That something in my town, something connected to the old asylum, is bleeding through into reality in ways that should not be possible. Anna itself is a small town in southern Illinois, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else and where nothing ever really changes. Except that the town is dying. Young people leave and never come back. Business is close. The population shrinks year after year. And anyone who has lived here long enough knows why. They know about the curse. They know about the Anna State Hospital and the darkness that permeates every inch of ground in this place. The hospital was built in the 1800s on land that had been a Native American burial ground. At least, that is what the stories say. The old settlers had ignored the warnings from the few indigenous people who still remained in the area. They had paid no attention to the sacred ground designation. They had simply begun construction. And from that moment onward, everything that happened in that hospital was suffused with a darkness that went beyond the normal horrors of an institution for the mentally ill. Patient records from the early years describe patients who would go catatonic for no medical reason. Patients who would speak in languages that no one in the hospital staff recognized. Patients whose conditions would improve dramatically, only to have them suddenly regress into violence and self-destruction. The hospital became known as a place where people went to get worse, not better. And the town of Anna became associated with tragedy, bad luck, and a kind of generalized curse that seemed to settle over everything. I grew up in Anna. My family has lived here for 4 generations. I should have left. Every rational part of my brain told me to get out, to move to a bigger city, to escape the jinx that had made the town's name synonymous with misfortune. But I stayed. I had a job here. I had roots. I had convinced myself that curses were superstition and that the town's reputation was simply the result of economic decline and bad timing. The asylum closed in 1994, officially shuttered due to lack of funding and changing mental health care practices. But the building had never been demolished. It still stands, a massive Victorian structure on the edge of town, its windows broken and dark, its grounds overgrown with weeds and twisted trees. It is the kind of building that teenagers dare each other to explore. The kind of building that serves as a focal point for all of the town, is fear and superstition and accumulated darkness. I had been hired to assess the structural integrity of the building. A development company from Chicago wanted to know if the asylum could be renovated and converted into luxury apartments. It was absurd, of course. Everyone in town said so. Everyone understood that renovating the asylum was impossible. You cannot convert a cursed building into a home. You cannot wash away decades of accumulated suffering and darkness with new paint and modern fixtures. But the developer did not believe in curses. And I needed the money. The first day I entered the asylum, I knew immediately that something was profoundly wrong with the place. It was not just the decay or the dust or the obvious signs of abandonment. It was something more fundamental. The air itself felt different inside the building. Colder, thicker, as if it was resistant to being breathed, as if it contained something that my lungs rejected on an instinctive level. I told myself that these sensations were psychological, that my prior knowledge of the building's history was creating a kind of confirmation bias, that I was seeing and feeling what I expected to see and feel. I set up my equipment and began my assessment. The basement was where I found the first sign that something was truly disturbing about this place. The walls were covered in scratches. Not recent scratches, but deep gouges in the concrete that suggested they had been made with tremendous force and sustained effort. They formed patterns, almost like writing, almost like something or someone had been trying to communicate a message to anyone who would eventually read it. And there were marks on the floor, circles drawn in something that might have been blood or might have been rust. Symbols inside the circles, patterns that looked almost ritualistic. Signs that suggested the basement had been used for something far darker than the standard functions of an asylum. I documented everything with my camera. I told myself that these were simply the remnants of patient behavior, the physical manifestations of mental illness carved into the architecture of the building. But even as I told myself this, I did not believe it. There was something in the basement that was older than the asylum. Something that had been there long before the building was constructed. Something that had been awakened when the asylum was built on ground that had been sacred and then violated. I should have left the basement then. I should have gone back upstairs and told the developer that I needed more time to complete my assessment. But I kept going deeper. I kept moving toward the back wall of the basement, toward a section that seemed even more disturbing than the rest. And that is where I found the door. It was not supposed to be there. It was not on the building's architectural plans. It was a small wooden door, barely 5 feet tall, built directly into the concrete wall. And it was locked. A padlock, heavily corroded by age, secured the door. And around the door frame, carved into the concrete itself, were names. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, names that had been scratched into the concrete. Some so old that they were barely legible, others more recent, all of them surrounding the door like a kind of supernatural registry. I tried to read some of the names. Most of them were illegible, but some of the more recent ones were clear enough. Sarah Mitchell, 1965. David Chen, 1972. Rebecca Garcia, 1981. Names, dates, all scratched around the perimeter of this forbidden door. That was when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the names was from 2 years ago, 2019. A name I recognized, a patient at Anna State Hospital who had been transferred there in the years before it closed. A patient whose family had reported his disappearance from the institution. A patient whose body was never found. My hands were shaking as I took photographs of the door and the names. I did not try to force it open. I did not try to break the lock. I just documented what I was seeing and then retreated from the basement. For 3 days, I tried to forget what I had found. I completed my structural assessment, concluding that the building was salvageable but would require extensive work. I submitted my report to the developer. I tried to move on with my life. But then Emma found her doll in the basement. She came to me with it on a Friday afternoon. She was holding it by one yarn arm, looking confused and scared. She asked me why her special doll was in the old scary building. She asked how it had gotten there when it lived in her bedroom. I have no explanation for how that doll ended up in the basement of the asylum. I know what I saw when I examined it. The doll was covered in dust that matched the dust composition of the asylum, this basement. It had been exposed to the elements for years, not days. It had deteriorated in ways that would take decades to occur. But Emma was holding it. Emma had somehow retrieved it from the asylum. And Emma had no memory of how she had gotten there or how long she had been in the building. That was when I began to understand that time itself had become fractured in Anna. That the boundaries between past and present had become permeable. That the curse was not just psychological or metaphorical. It was something that was actively rewriting reality in the town. I have spent the last 3 weeks investigating. I have talked to other families in Anna. I have found that many of them have experienced similar phenomena. Objects appearing in impossible places. Memories that do not match documented events. Loved ones going missing for hours or days with no recollection of where they have been. And all of these events seem connected to the asylum. I have found records suggesting that the asylum was built directly over a mass grave. A grave containing the remains of indigenous people who had died defending their sacred ground against the encroachment of settlers. A grave that had been covered over and forgotten, and the building constructed on top of it had become a kind of wound in reality. A place where the dead could reach through into the living world and pull people backward in time or forward in time or sideways into dimensions that normal people should never experience. The developer has backed out of his offer to renovate the asylum. He did so suddenly, after visiting the building for only 10 minutes. He did not explain his decision. He simply said that he could feel something wrong with the place. He said that the building was sick in a way that money could not fix. But the damage is done. The asylum has been disturbed. The seal has been broken. And now the curse is spreading. It is no longer confined to just the building. It is beginning to infect the entire town of Anna. I have noticed it in small ways. Traffic lights malfunctioning in patterns that seem deliberate. People appearing and disappearing from conversations with no memory of the interaction. Children reporting encounters with people who died decades ago. And worst of all, the feeling that is spreading through the town. The feeling that time itself is unreliable. That the past is bleeding through into the present. That the dead are waking up and beginning to remember what was taken from them. I have tried to leave. I have packed my car and driven toward the town limits. But every road I take leads me back to Anna. I have tried 3 times now. Each time, I end up back where I started, confused and unable to explain how I got there. The town itself has become a loop, a cycle, a kind of temporal trap. Last night, I heard voices in my basement, old voices, speaking in a language I could not identify, speaking with the tones of people who had been underground for centuries, speaking directly to me, telling me things that I did not want to hear. They told me that the asylum was just the beginning. They told me that soon, the entire town would be uninhabitable. They told me that Anna itself would become like the asylum, a place where the living and the dead existed in a constant state of collision. And they told me something else that has been eating at me ever since. They told me that my daughter is one of them now. That by handling the doll that had been in their sacred place, Emma has opened a door inside herself. That she is beginning to exist in multiple times simultaneously. That soon, she will be pulled completely into their world, and that there is nothing I can do to stop it. My question for you is this: if you discovered that your entire town was cursed and that the curse was spreading to everyone around you, would you try to break the curse even if it meant confronting something far older and more powerful than human understanding? Or would you accept your fate and try to protect those you love by preparing them for what is coming? Write your answer in the comments, because I honestly do not know the right choice anymore. I can feel the curse intensifying. I can feel the boundaries between past and present becoming thinner every day. I can feel the dead pressing against the veil that separates their world from ours. And I can feel Emma slipping away from me, pulled toward that forbidden door in the basement of the asylum, drawn toward the mass grave beneath the building, toward the thousands of indigenous spirits who have been waiting so long for the living world to acknowledge them. Anna is dying. The town itself is becoming a haunted place. A place that exists outside normal time. A place where the curse is supreme. And I fear that soon, no one will be able to leave. No one will be able to escape. We will all become like the asylum itself. Empty shells, haunted forever by the presence of the dead who refuse to stay buried.